G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Isaiah. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. Okay, so we're into session 8. We're gonna get through from chapter 10, verse 28, down to chapter 13, verse 16, I think it is. Okay, quick recap. We see Assyria. Assyria is a god of God's anger. It's a rod of God's anger. God commissions Assyria to be his rod of judgment against Israel and Judah. We see Assyria, she boasts about her own strength and that she did it all on her own because she's conquered everybody ahead of her. Even though she knew that her commission against Israel and against Judah was by divine decree. She overstepped the mark and she went beyond this decree and commission. She was boasting how easy it was for all the cities that fell to her. And so she believed, well, Jerusalem won't be any different. Jerusalem will be a walkover to conquer her. Her boast, Assyria's boast, was that none of the gods of the nations could stand against her. And because she overcame the god of Samaria, which Jerusalem, God would offer no resistance. Why did he say that? Because, well, Samaria said that they worshipped Jehovah. They did, but in a corrupt way. They were actually idol worshippers. But not so with Jerusalem. At this point in time, Jerusalem temple is still standing, and the God of Jehovah God was Jerusalem's God. Now, because Assyria conquers God with the idols of other nations, because Assyria compares God to the idols with the idols of the other nations, Assyria would now be punished. Power is with God and not with Assyria. Assyria's boasting is that of a tool against its maker. Remember, Assyria was just a tool in God's hand. And so God strikes them with consumption. In actual fact, it was brought about by the angel of Jehovah, where in that incident where they came against Judah, 185,000 were wiped out in one night. And so what we're going to see is that God strikes them down. Isaiah then moves into the prophetic future then to give Israel some comfort, because he's now talking in that day in the prophetic future, in the time of the tribulation. There'll be Isaiah is telling them that, listen, there's going to be a remnant that will survive. You won't all get wiped out. There's going to be a remnant, and the remnant of Israel is going to, as he said, lean upon Jehovah, the Holy One of Israel. Why? Because they're going to come to recognize that Yeshua is the Messiah. And this was all a fulfillment of, remember the promise of Isaiah's son. His name was Shear-Jashub, and Shear-Jashub means the remnant shall return. So there's a promise of a final restoration for Israel. So they're going to make it through the tribulation in the future. So now we come to this session. We see the Assyrian, back into Isaiah's time, the Assyrian invasion in chapter 10, verse 28 to 32. He says here, he's come to Aith, he's passed through Migron. At Michmash, he lays up his baggage. They've gone over the pass. They've taken up their lodging at Geba. Ramah trembles. Gibeah of Saul is fled. Cry aloud with your voice, O daughter of Galim. Hearken, O Laishah. O you poor Anathoth. Madmenah is a fugitive. The inhabitants of Gibeon flee for safety. This very day shall he halt at Nob. He shakes his hand at the mount of the daughter of Zion, the hill of Jerusalem. Okay, so this is the Assyrian invasion of the southern kingdom, Judah. So a number of cities here are listed, and they're listed in a north to south direction towards Jerusalem. Each of these cities that we see in verse 28 to 32, each of these cities would move a person closer to Jerusalem. Several cities are mentioned. First, we see Aith, or biblical Ai. That's around about 30 miles from Jerusalem. And then Migron is 15 miles. Michmash is 7.5 miles. And then we go down to Geba is 6 miles. Ramah is 5 miles. And then it comes right down to Galim, 2.7 miles from Jerusalem. So armies coming further and further, or closer and closer to Jerusalem. And then we have the 10th is Anathoth, 2 miles from Jerusalem. And then Madmenah was a mile from Jerusalem. And then we have the 13th one was Nob, N-O-B, and that was built upon the top of Mount Scopus. And today that's where the Hebrew University stands. And so when you stand upon Mount Scopus, you can do what this king does in verse 32. He's standing on Mount Scopus at Nob, and he's able to shake his fist against Jerusalem. While all the Assyrians were able to destroy all these cities mentioned in this paragraph, because on their way down to Jerusalem, plus many others, remember, because they destroyed 46 of Judah's fortified cities. They got as far as the very neck, which is Jerusalem itself, which they did with Nob. But Isaiah prophesied that Jerusalem would stand. And so we're going to see that in verses 33 to 34, the Assyrian forest, which Assyria is likened to a forest, will now be destroyed. Behold, the Lord Jehovah of hosts will lop the boughs with terror, and the height of stature shall be hewn down, and the lofty shall be brought low. And he will cut down the thickets of the forest with iron, and Lebanon shall fall by a mighty one. So what we're seeing here is that the army of Assyria that was standing in front of Jerusalem is viewed as a dense forest. Now all of its trees will be cut down as a fulfillment of the prophecies of verses 17 to 19 earlier in chapter 10. The passage begins here in verse 33 with the statement that it is the Lord, Jehovah of hosts, who will do the felling of the trees. Now, moving right on down to Isaiah 37 verse 36, this person will be the angel of Jehovah. Now, angel of Jehovah is always the second person of the Trinity. And when this person becomes a man, that man is Jesus, Yeshua. So with this promise of God's intervention on behalf of his people, the fourth section of the book of Emmanuel now comes to an end. Now, we're looking at the reign of Emmanuel, and this goes from chapter 11, verse 1, down to chapter 12, verse 6. And this is the fifth major section of the book of Emmanuel, and it deals now with the meaning of Isaiah's name. Remember, Isaiah's name means salvation is of the Lord. So now he deals with the reign of Emmanuel. Now, this section here is simply a development of chapter 9, verse 7. Remember, chapter 9, verse 7 says, of the increase of his government and of peace there shall be no end, upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from henceforth, even forever. The zeal of Jehovah of hosts will perform this. Now, it's going to be developed by the three lines of messianism here. First of all, we're going to see the messianic person. And then we're going to see the messianic people, and then we're going to see the messianic program. That's what we're going to go as we go through this particular section. Messianic person we see in chapter 11, verses 1 to 5. And there shall come forth a shoot out of the stock of Jesse, and a branch out of his roots shall bear fruit. The Spirit of Jehovah shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of Jehovah. And his delight shall be in the fear of Jehovah, and he shall not judge after the sight of his eyes, neither decide after the hearing of his ears. But with righteousness shall he judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall smite the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips shall he slay the wicked. And righteousness shall be the girdle of his waist, and faithfulness the girdle of his loins. So here we have the messianic person. The contrast here is between chapter 11, verse 1, and chapter 10, verse 34. Chapter 10, verse 34, remember, while the Assyrian forest is cut down forever, here we see in chapter 11, verse 1, the stump of Israel will bring forth a shoot. So Assyria is gone by this time, and now Israel will spring forth a shoot. Now, many Jewish sages, rabbinic sages, were willing to interpret Isaiah 11, verses 1 to 5 of speaking of the Messiah. However, they did not stick to the literal interpretation of the text, but also offered King Hezekiah as fulfilling the prophecies of these verses. A literal interpretation of this section of this passage here goes something like this. The chapter 11, verse 1 stands in contrast to the very last verse of chapter 10, which is verse 34. While in that verse, the Assyrian forest is viewed as having been cut down forever. The stump of Israel would bring forth a shoot, meaning it would spring forth new life. That's pretty much a bit of a paraphrase. So the stump of Israel will bring forth new life. The word stock that we see here means it's a stump of a tree that has been felled. And we see where it says a shoot, that's a living sprout from what appeared to be a dead stump. Why does he use Jesse here rather than David? The reason is connected with a stump. Remember, we're no longer looking now at a glorious tree, but we're looking at a cut down stump. David was a majestic, powerful king. Now, Jesse, his father, was not a rich man. Jesse's life was not filled with pomp and splendor. In fact, Jesse was a small shepherd in the town of Bethlehem. So the point Isaiah makes here is that when the glorious house of David is reduced to nothing but a cut down stump, nothing pretty much left of it, at that point, Messiah will come. So when the house of David is reduced to what it was in Jesse's day, not in David's day, it is at that point that the Messiah will appear. At that point, the Davidic dynasty has lost its power and glory. Now, Amos is one of the 12 minor prophets. Amos chapter 9, verse 11 presents a similar picture. I'll read that to you now. Amos 9:11 says, "In that day will I raise up the tabernacle of David that is fallen, and close up the breaches thereof. And I will raise up its ruins, and I'll build it as in the days of old." So Amos 9:11 says that when the glory of the house of David is nothing but a broken down hut, that is when the Messiah appears. And at that point, a branch out of David's roots shall bear fruit. The fact that this branch would not grow out of the stump, but out of the roots, demonstrate the level of poverty of the Davidic dynasty. Now, while it has a very lowly beginning, at that point, it'll begin to bear fruit. So what we see is that from humble beginnings, a power will begin to grow to a great height. A twig will become a great tree. A state of humiliation will be followed by a state of exaltation, glorification, and perfection. Now, Isaiah 53 verse 2 will make the same point. The Messiah will have lowly beginnings. Messiah, he grows up like any other person. Isaiah 53 says, when we see at him, there's no beauty in him that we should desire. For he grew up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of a dry ground. He has no form nor comeliness. When we see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. So this verse here concentrates on the lowly origin of Messiah at the time of his birth, when things are in a very low state, especially for the mighty house of David, rather than the majesty of his kingdom that will be seen at his second coming. Yeah, remember that Mary, when she had to offer her sacrifices at the altar for the birth of her son, she could only afford 2 little turtle doves. Now, that's because that was the least offering you could offer, and that's all they could afford. So they're a very humble beginnings when Jesus was born. In verse 2, we see the Spirit of Jehovah shall rest upon him. This is upon this messianic person, and it's gonna this is his endowment with the Holy Spirit. Now, we're told several factors concerning the messianic person. The sevenfold aspect of the attributes of the Spirit is given, and this is given to this person, and this is what is meant elsewhere. He receives the fullness of the Spirit. He received the Spirit without measure. Now, this is a picture, what we see here, this is a picture of a menorah with 7 branches. The middle stem that we see in this is what he calls the Spirit of Jehovah. This is followed then by 3 semicircular branches. Now, he'll use the word Spirit 3 more times after that. Each time the word Spirit is used, 2 more attributes are given. Then the list goes on to say that the attributes are wisdom, understanding, counsel, might, knowledge, and the fear of Jehovah. Now, right on down into the last book of the Bible, in Revelation chapter 1, verse 4, we're told that the messianic person has the fullness of the Holy Spirit. This is Jesus, the God-man. The 7 spirits belong to Christ in Revelation chapter 3, verse 1 and chapter 5, verse 6. Now remember, back in John chapter 3, verse 34 to 35, John the Baptist described Jesus as having the fullness of the Spirit. For he whom God has sent speaks the words of God, for he gives not the Spirit by measure. So the New Testament teaches that all who believe in Yeshua as Messiah are given a measure of the Holy Spirit. Therefore, every believer has different gifts and ministries, and we can find it in 1 Corinthians 12. No one believer has all of the gifts. Why? Because God has ordained that the members of the church should be mutually dependent upon each other. Jesus, however, was given the Spirit without measure. In Scripture, the number 7 signifies perfection or completeness or fullness. The sevenfold nature of the Spirit in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 2 is therefore synonymous with the measureless fullness in John chapter 3, verse 34, where John the Baptist says he had the Spirit, Jesus had the Spirit without measure. It also corresponds to the 7 spirits of Revelation chapter 1, verse 4, and chapter 3, verse 1, and chapter 4, verse 5, and 5, verse 6. In all those verses, we see the 7 spirits being mentioned there. The picture of the 7 spirits as a 7-branch menorah is found in Revelation chapter 4, verse 5. Now, with the exception of the first attribute, all the other aspects are listed in pairs. We have the spirit of wisdom and understanding. This describes Messiah's intellectual life. Hebrew word for wisdom, which is chokmah, refers to administrative wisdom. So what's that saying? The Messiah would possess the ability to render right decisions at the right time so that they could be acted upon. Now, we see an example of this in Luke chapter 2, verse 52, and Matthew chapter 13, verse 54. Now, that's the spirit of wisdom. Now, we're going to look at the next one, which is the spirit of understanding. Now, this is the ability to choose the best option among all the possibilities. And we see this in Luke 2, verse 47, and John 2, verse 25. Because Messiah would have the spirit of wisdom and understanding, he would possess discernment and insight into the nature of things. We then move on to the spirit of counsel and might. Now, this describes his practical life. Counsel is the ability to draw the right conclusions. It's the ability to devise an adequate plan for the situation and to develop a comprehensive strategy. And Matthew 22, verses 15 to 22, gives an insight into this. Might, the spirit of might refers to the ability to execute one's plans with energy or with vim and vigor. Luke 24, verse 19, with power. Okay, And then finally, we have the spirit of knowledge and of the fear of Jehovah. Now, this describes Messiah's spiritual life. Knowledge is the understanding one develops from experience, and here it is the experience with God. It is a knowledge related to love, which we see in Hosea 2, verse 20, and Hosea 4, verse 1 and verse 6, and Hosea 6, 6, also Matthew 11, 25 to 27. And then finally, we have fear. Now, fear here is reverential fear, which stems from recognition of God's holiness. The description used in verse 2 is a representative of the menorah, which is that 7-branch lampstand that we saw previously with that image that we had. Now, verses 3 to 4 provide 5 results of the endowment with the Spirit. The first 2 results are given in verse 3. It says, his delight shall be in the fear of Jehovah, and he shall not judge after the sight of his eyes, neither decide after the hearing of his ears. So, first result is that Messiah will exercise judgment that is based on his relationship with God. His delight shall be in the fear of Jehovah. Hebrew means to delight in the scent. That's the smell, the aroma of anything. Here, it's the aroma. Here, the fear of God, it's seen as a pleasant fragrance. Messiah, Jesus, receives delight from this reverential fear of God. Second, he will not judge by outward appearances. The third, fourth, and fifth results of the endowment with the Spirit are given in verse 4. But with righteousness shall he judge the poor and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall smite the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips shall he slay the wicked. So the third result here is related to the second one. Rather than judging according to outward appearances, Messiah will judge on the basis of inward righteousness. And the fourth result is that he will judge the earth on behalf of the poor and the needy. Now, Hebrew word for meek, or where it said poor and needy here, is anav now, which is A-N-A-V. Now, Isaiah uses this term frequently when speaking of the faithful remnant, the believing remnant. The believing remnant are seen by the prophets as the poor and needy. And we see this in Isaiah's book. We see it in Isaiah 29, verse 19, and Isaiah 61, verse 1. The fifth result here is that Messiah will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth and slay the wicked with the breath of his lips. Now, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 8 tells us this, along with Revelation 19, verse 15, and Revelation 19, verse 21. In other words, both the earth and the wicked will experience the full force of his punitive righteousness. The judgment is going to be detailed for us when we get down to chapter 65, verse 20. We're only in chapter 11, so we've got a way to go. Verse 5 now concludes the section by describing Messiah's character. And righteousness shall be the girdle of his waist, and faithfulness the girdle of his loins. Now, Hebrew term for girdle is ezor. What it is, it's a belt or a waistband which is worn by someone who is ready to engage in a wrestling bout with an opponent. That's what it's described like here. So what we see here is that Messiah Jesus is girded to face a foe and engage in battle, and he's fully equipped to do so. Now, the next line of messianism discussed in chapter 11 is the messianic program. And this we see in verses 6 to 10. Now, first up, we're going to look at the animal kingdom in verses 6 to 9. This is what's going to happen in the kingdom. And the wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together. And the little child shall lead them, and the cow and the bear shall feed. Their young ones shall lie down together. The lion shall eat straw like the ox, and the sucking child shall play in the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put his hand in the adder's den. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, For the earth shall be full of the knowledge of Jehovah as the waters cover the sea. So here, Isaiah begins with the messianic program in relationship to the animal kingdom. 6 to 8, in verses 6 to 8, all animals will live in peace. Animals that are now carnivorous in the millennial kingdom, messianic kingdom, will become vegetarian. The wolf and the lamb, the leopard and the young goat, the calf and the young lion will all stay together. They'll all be led by a little child. No one will be feeding on the other. Verse 8, the snake and the young child will live in peace. These are two of the oldest animals, the snake and man. Isaiah will say a similar thing in 65 verse 25, where he says, the wolf and the lamb shall feed together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox, and dust shall be the serpent's food. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, says Jehovah. So see, even in the kingdom, dust will be the serpent's food. The animal kingdom will revert to what it was before the fall. All the animals that are carnivorous will become vegetarians. And the reason for this is given in verse 9. The reason is the messianic reign, where the knowledge of Jehovah will fill the entire world. Yeah, the term mountain in verse 9, it may refer to the large mountain which we saw right back in Isaiah chapter 2, verse 2, which is going to be in the center of the nation of Israel, upon which Jerusalem will rest. Now, on the other hand, as we know, the term mountain, when used symbolically, means a kingdom or a king or a nation or an empire. Probably here, as in Isaiah 65, verse 25, it's dealing with the messianic kingdom when Messiah will reign over the entire world from the throne of David in Jerusalem. That fits better in this particular verse. Now, having discussed the changes the messianic program will bring about in the animal kingdom, verse 10 now turns to the Gentile nations. And it shall come to pass in that day, this is a future day, that the root of Jesse that stands for an ensign of the peoples, unto him shall the nations seek, and his resting place shall be glorious. So here, messianic program as it deals with the Gentile nations, we see here in verse 10. In that day, what day? In the day of Emmanuel's reign. The root of Jesse will serve as a banner or an ensign to the Gentile nations. Now, elsewhere, the Messiah is called the root of David, as we see in the book of Revelation, Revelation 5, verse 5, and Revelation 22, verse 16. What we're seeing here is that this emphasizes his first coming, and the other emphasizes his second coming. The root of Jesse is the first coming, the root of David is the second coming. The term ensign refers to a high pole with waving banners, which was usually erected on a very high hill to serve as an assembling point for the people. The root, which was planted in the ground in verses 1 to 2, will eventually become a high mountain and the center of Gentile attention. This is the fulfillment of Genesis chapter 49, verse 10. In Genesis 49:10, it says, the scepter, that's the royal scepter, shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the obedience of the peoples be. Okay, when the plural term peoples is used, it refers to Gentiles. The verse here concludes with a prophecy regarding Messiah's return, stating that his resting place will be glorious. Now, Paul, the Apostle Paul, applied Isaiah 11:10 to Gentile evangelism in Romans 15:12. Romans 15:12 and Isaiah 11:10. Paul merges them together. The ensign or banner was used for 4 different reasons as far as biblical history was concerned. First, for the purpose of communicating information, and we see that in Jeremiah 50, verse 2. Second, for gathering the military troops, as in Isaiah 13:2 and 18:3, also Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 21. And third, we see it for gathering fugitives in Jeremiah 4:6. And fourth, we see it also now for gathering people or peoples, as in this instance here, and in chapter 5, verse 26, and chapter 49, verse 22, and 62, verse 10. Isaiah will have much more to say concerning the Messianic program later on in this book. The third line of Messianism is the Messianic people. Isaiah now develops this line in two parts. He covered the regathering of the Messianic people in chapter 11, verse 11 to 16, and we're going to see their song of praise in chapter 12, verses 1 to 6. Here we see the Messianic people first up, and we're going to see here their regathering in verses 11 to 16. And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord will set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people that shall remain, from Assyria and from Egypt and from Pathros and from Cush and from Elam and from Shinar and from Hamath and from the islands of the sea. And he will set up an ensign for the nations, and will assemble the outcasts of Israel, and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. The envy also of Ephraim shall depart, and they that vex Judah shall be cut off. Ephraim shall not envy Judah, and Judah shall not vex Ephraim. And they shall fly down upon the shoulder of the Philistines on the west. Together shall they despoil the children of the east. They shall put forth their hand upon Edom and Moab, and the children of Ammon shall obey them. And Jehovah will utterly destroy the tongue of the Egyptian sea, and with his scorching wind will he wave his hand over the river, and will smite it into 7 streams, and cause men to march over dry shod. Verse 16, and there shall be a highway for the remnant of his people, that shall remain from Assyria, like as there was for Israel in the day that he came up out of the land of Egypt. Okay. Now we have 4 points here made concerning this regathering. First, the final restoration under the Messiah will be a second worldwide regathering. In verses 11 to 12, and that's in verse 11 to 12. Now, the phrase "in that day" puts the events here into the prophetic future. So this worldwide regathering in faith for the purpose of blessing is called by Isaiah as the second worldwide regathering for Israel. If this final worldwide regathering is the second, when is the first? Verse 12 shows that the regathering will be from all over the world. He will set up an ensign for the nations, and will assemble the outcasts of Israel, and to gather together the dispersed of Judah from the 4 corners of the earth. Locations listed in verse 11 from Assyria stretching to the islands of the sea emphasize the huge area from which the people of Israel will be gathered. However, as the phrase "from the 4 corners of the earth" in verse 12 shows, the regathering will not be limited to this area. So this answers the question, if this final worldwide regathering is the second, when is the first? First regathering could not have been returned from Babylon, because that was hardly a worldwide regathering from the 4 corners of the earth. The first worldwide regathering was also mentioned by other prophets. The first worldwide regathering was in unbelief in preparation for judgment. Now, passages dealing with this worldwide regathering in unbelief in preparation for judgment include Ezekiel chapter 20, verses 33 to 38, and Ezekiel 22, verses 17 to 22, and also Zephaniah. Zephaniah, one of the minor prophets, Zephaniah chapter 2, verses 1 to 2. The present state of Israel today is the fulfillment of these passages, that speak of an initial worldwide regathering in unbelief in preparation for judgment. When did this start? This started in 1948. What we see here is the judgment will be that of the Great Tribulation. However, that worldwide regathering will be followed by a second final regathering. The present state as we have today will collapse in the middle of the tribulation, and there will be another worldwide dispersion. Nevertheless, that will be followed by this second worldwide regathering in faith in preparation for the blessings of the millennial kingdom. So this final regathering is dealt with by Isaiah in this passage. The reason for the assembling of the Gentiles in verse 10 is to aid in the regathering of the Jews. God is going to use the Gentile nations to gather or regather Jews in the land. Isaiah will have more to say about this in later chapters of his book. So those who hold to replacement theology, they disagree with this view of the regathering, and they teach that the regathering mentioned in these verses was fulfilled by the return of the Jews to their land after the Babylonian captivity. And we know that that is not a worldwide regathering. So the first element of this regathering of the Messianic people is that it will be a worldwide event and the final restoration of the Jewish people under the Messiah. The second element is seen in verses 13 to 14. The envy also of Ephraim shall depart, and they that vex Judah shall be cut off. Now Ephraim shall not envy Judah, and Judah shall not vex Ephraim. The second point about this regathering is that there will be a restoration of unity between Israel and Judah, according to verses 13 to 14. In verse 13, there's a restoration of peace between the two Jewish kingdoms. The famous Ezekiel account of the two sticks makes a similar point in Ezekiel 37, verses 15 to 23. Now the question is, what is meant by Ephraim's envy of Judah, and why was Ephraim envious of Judah? Now remember, Ephraim was the name for the northern kingdom. Now, Psalm 78 answers the questions regarding Ephraim's envy of Judah and why was Judah vexing Ephraim. I'm going to read Psalm 78, verse 9 to 11 for you. Psalm 78, verse 9 to 11. The children of Ephraim, being armed and carrying bows, turned back in the day of battle. They kept not the covenant of God and refused to walk in his law, and they forgot his doings and his wondrous works that he had showed them. So in this passage, this is 78 verses 9 to 11, Psalm 78, 9 to 11. In this passage, Ephraim was not willing to help the other tribes in a time of danger. And we have a couple of examples of this in the biblical text in Judges, the book of Judges, chapter 8, verses 1 to 3, and chapter 12, verse 1 to 6. It's Judges. However, Ephraim also tended to turn away from following the Lord. And as a result, now we see further on in Psalm 78, verses 67 to 69, it says, moreover, he refused the tent of Joseph and chose not the tribe of Ephraim, but chose the tribe of Judah, the Mount Zion, which he loved. And he built his sanctuary like the heights, like the earth which he has established forever. So what we see here is, therefore, what we see in this here is that when God finally chose a place to establish a place for his temple, he chose Judah over Ephraim. Even though Ephraim had the first crack or the inside track at it because of Shiloh. Remember, that was where the tabernacle was originally established, and that was in the tribe of Ephraim. Because of Ephraim's actions during the time the tabernacle was in Shiloh, when God made a final choice, he chose Jerusalem and Mount Zion in Judah over against everything in Ephraim. And because of that, there was envy ever since between Ephraim and Judah. When the kingdom finally split, the primary reason that Jeroboam set up the golden calf was to prevent members of the northern kingdom from worshiping God in the temple of Jerusalem in the southern kingdom. But now this envy of Ephraim toward Judah and Judah's harassing of Ephraim will cease. There will be a restoration of peace between the two kingdoms. Also, we see in verse 14, they're going to be united in battle against their opponents. In the west, they'll be united against the Philistines. In the east, they'll be united against Moab, Ammon, and Edom. The third point here is that the regathering will be accompanied by miracles. In verse 15, it says, the tongue of the Egyptian sea. This has to do with what is now known as the Gulf of Suez, which is also known as the tongue of the Red Sea. That's going to dry up. And the river with a capital R refers to the Euphrates River. So the mighty Euphrates will be split so that it will also be reduced to 7 smaller streams. So it's going to be much easier to cross the Euphrates once it is reduced to such a small 7 smaller streams. And this will enable the Jews from Egypt and from the Mesopotamian region to return much more easily into Israel. Fourth point is that the remnant shall return. We see this in verse 16. We see there's a highway. So verse 16, it says that there should be a highway for the remnant of his people that shall remain from Assyria, like as there was for Israel in the day that he came up out of the land of Egypt. So this is just as during the Exodus period, there was a highway out of Egypt, which will enable the final regathering to much easier. Hebrew word here for highway, by the way, is Mesilah, and it never refers to a city street, but it refers to a raised public road. So the highway concept is favored by Isaiah, which we're going to see Isaiah use it several more times. Isaiah 19:23, when we get there, we'll see it again. Isaiah 33:8, 33:8, 35:8, 35:8, 40 verse 3, 40 verse 3, 49 verse 11, 49:11, and 62:10. Okay, we'll see it when we get down to those passages. Now, the concept of the final regathering being a greater Passover than the previous one, a new Exodus, is brought out in Jeremiah chapter 16, verses 14 to 15, and Jeremiah 23, verses 7 to 8. After the Jews crossed over the Red Sea out of Egypt, what is the first thing that they did? Well, the first thing they did was to sing a hymn. And we see that in Exodus 15, verses 1 to 18. Now, in Isaiah, after the final regathering in this greater Exodus, they'll also sing a hymn, which we're going to see in chapter 12, verses 1 to 6. Here we go. We see their song of praise in 1 to 6 of chapter 12. And in that day you shall say, I'll give thanks unto you, O Jehovah. For though you were angry with me, your anger was turned away, and you comforted me. Behold, God is my salvation. I will trust and will not be afraid. For Jehovah, even Jehovah, is my strength and song, and he has become my salvation. Therefore, with joy shall you draw water out of the wells of salvation. Okay, we'll just look at these first 3 verses. The hymn here, even though it's 6 verses, it's in 2 stanzas. In the first stanza, verses 1 to 3, this looks back upon God's judgments and its resulting salvation. The rabbinic view is that in the days of the Messiah, people will look back and see how everything worked out for the best. They'll be able to thank God for all that happened to them, even though it appeared to be his vengeance at the time. Verse 2 illustrates the meaning of the name Isaiah. Behold, God is my salvation. Because God is Israel's salvation, she will trust in him and not be afraid. And in verse 3 concludes the first stanza with the symbol of water. Therefore, with joy shall you draw water out of the wells of salvation. And then in the next stanza, verses 4 to 6, and in that day shall you say, give thanks unto Jehovah, call upon his name, declare his doings among the peoples, make mention that his name is exalted. Sing unto Jehovah, for he has done excellent things. Let this be known in all the earth. Cry aloud and shout, you inhabitant of Zion, for great in the midst of you is the Holy One of Israel. The second stanza is a hymn of praise to let the world know of God's deeds. Each of the verses 4 to 6 begins with a command. Verse 4 consists of 4 imperatives. And in that day shall you say, give thanks unto Jehovah, call upon his name, declare his doings among the peoples, make mention that his name is exalted. So, besides giving thanks to God and calling on his name, Israel is to declare all that God has done. Verse 5 elaborates on these commands. Sing unto Jehovah, for he has done excellent things. Let this be known in all the earth. So the Jewish nation is now urged to spread the news of the wonderful things God has done throughout the world. Verse 6 addresses the residents of Jerusalem. Cry aloud and shout, you inhabitant of Zion, for great in the midst of you is the Holy One of Israel. And with this, he ends the book of Emmanuel. Now, we're coming into the oracles against the nations, and this is going to go from chapter 13, verse 1 down to chapter 23, verse 8. At this point now, Isaiah turns away from his own people, Judah and Jerusalem, and he now begins to deal with the surrounding nations. He deals with those nations that come in contact with the Jewish nation and the effect that they will have upon the Jewish nation. First up, we're going to look at Babylon. Babylon is going to go from chapter 13, 1 down to chapter 14, verse 23. So the first nation he comes to and the one that he spends the most time on is Babylon. This is subdivided into 3 parts. Now, when he deals with Babylon here, as he will several times in his book, sometimes he's going to deal with the Babylon of his day, which was, at this point in time, it was rising. When he's doing this, it was rising in power, although it wouldn't reach the peak for another 100 years. However, sometimes he dealt with the Babylon of the end days. The city of Babylon, we know from other prophecies, will be rebuilt and it will become the capital of the Antichrist. Other prophets that had messages against Babylon included Lamentations chapter 2 verse 14, Lamentations 2:14, and Jeremiah chapters 50 to 51, and a little prophet called Nahum in chapter 1 verse 1. So that's Lamentations 2:14, Jeremiah 50 to 51, and Nahum 1 verse 1. Nevertheless, these and other prophecies require the rebuilding of the city of Babylon to become the capital of the Antichrist. The following gives a complete rundown of the prophecies of Babylon that Isaiah gives, and then the prophecies of the other prophets. Now, I didn't write all these down. However, we'll try and do it. Now, besides chapters 13 and 14, he deals with Babylon in 21, 1 to 10. 21, 1 to 10. There he deals with the Babylon of his own day. In chapters 43, 14 to 15, his point there is that the Babylonians will become fugitives. That's chapters 43, 14 to 15, Babylonians fugitives. Isaiah 46, 1 to 2. Isaiah 46, 1 to 2 says that the gods of Babylon are judged. Chapter 47, 1 to 15 says that judgment will be meted out against the Babylonian occultism. That's chapter 47, 1 to 15. Chapter 48, 15 and 20, 48, 15 and 20 says that judgment will fall upon Babylon. These are the Isaiah passages that deal with this particular city. Second, we have Jeremiah chapter 50 to 51, heavily emphasizes the totality of Babylon's destruction. And then we have in Zechariah 5, 5 to 11, Babylon in the future will also become the economic capital of the world. The remaining references we find in Revelation, Revelation 14 verse 8 and Revelation 16 verse 9. That's 14, 8, 16 and 16, 9. Deal with the rejoicing over Babylon's fall. Revelation 17, 1 to 8 deals, 1 to 18, sorry, Revelation 17, 1 to 18 deals with the fall of ecclesiastical or religious Babylon. And then Revelation 18, 1 to 24, 18, 1 to 24, deals with the fall of political and economic Babylon. The Babylon that Isaiah deals with in chapters 13 and 14 deals with the Babylon of the tribulation. Verse 6 places the events we're about to read about within the day of Jehovah, which is the most common biblical term in both testaments for the tribulation. Okay. Chapter 13, verse 1. The burden of Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amos did see. Word burden here is a Hebrew word, massa, M-A-S-S-A. It means a heavy weight. It's a heavy weight. It's a heavy weight or a heavy message that God has against a specific nation about to be mentioned. The term refers to a prophecy that contains a message of judgment. The divine message is a heavy load both for the prophet who must pass it on and for the recipients. It is a weighty, burdensome kind of message that God has against a specific nation about to be mentioned. The word burden also has the meaning of an oracle or a vision within it. Now, in this entire segment of chapter 13, chapter 13 to chapter 23, he uses this word heavily. God has some heavy messages or burdens against these nations, these Gentile nations. Examples include chapter 14, verse 28, where in the year that King Ahaz died was this burden. In addition, it's a burden against the Philistines. Chapter 15, we have the burden of Moab. Chapter 17, the burden of Damascus. Chapter 19, the burden of Egypt. 21, the burden of the wilderness of the sea. 21, again, the burden of Duma. So we're going to see all these burdens that Isaiah is going to bring for these nations. So this is the key word in this segment of the book, the word burden. So here we see the gathering of the anti-Babylon forces in verses 2 to 5. Set ye up an ensign upon the bare mountain, lift up the voice unto them, wave the hand, that they may go into the gates of the nobles. I have commanded my consecrated ones, yea, I have called my mighty men for my anger, even my proudly exulting ones. The noise of a multitude in the mountains, as of a great people, the noise of a tumult of the kingdoms of the nations gathered together. Jehovah of hosts is mustering the host for the battle. They come from a far country, from the uttermost part of heaven, even Jehovah, and the weapons of his indignation to destroy the whole land. So here in verses 2 to 5, the burden of Babylon is that a gathering of nations and armies is taking place for the purpose of destroying the city of Babylon. The ensign principle is used again for the gathering of military troops here. Now there's a threefold summons here in verse 2. First of all, lift up the ensign or banner. Now the mountain, it says here the mountain is bare because it is treeless. Nothing blocks the view of those gathered. Second, lift up the voice. The voice is that of a military command. Third, wave the hand. They are to wave the hands in the sense of giving directions in the way the army should move. The army should move toward Babylon. It denotes a vigorous and violent waving. And the purpose of the threefold summons is that they might enter into the city as conquerors. And the purpose is that they might enter into the gates of the nobles. Time. Let me just... This threefold summons is now followed by a threefold command in verse 3. First, it concerns God's consecrated ones. Second, it concerns God's mighty men. These are the men of his anger, for Babylon will now experience the wrath of God. Third, it concerns my proudly exulting ones, those who are exulting in the assurance of victory, rejoicing in God's majesty. Now, who are these consecrated ones? Well, Hebrew is Kadash, or Kadosh, which can mean to be holy or to be set apart or to be consecrated. So it can refer to saints. Now, if this is the meaning of the word, then in verse 3, it refers to Gentile believers. Now, we know from other passages like Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 to 46, that during the course of the tribulation, the Gentiles will fall into two different camps. The Gentiles will either be pro-Semitic or anti-Semitic, either for the Jews or against the Jews. The anti-Semitics are labeled as goats. The pro-Semites are labeled as sheep. So what we have here is the sheep Gentiles gathering who are not in favor of Antichrist's campaign against the Jews, against Israel. What we have here are these sheep Gentiles who are gathering to destroy the capital city of the Antichrist. This will be part of the campaign of Armageddon. The campaign of Armageddon is a military campaign that has 8 stages to it. The gathering of the sheep Gentiles will occur in the second stage. Now, in verses 4 to 5 is the answer to the call. It is an international gathering because it is answered by many nations. The noise of a tumult of the kingdoms of the nations gathered together. Now, the terms kingdoms and nations indicate that this will be an international gathering, and Jehovah himself will do the mustering of this particular army for battle. The purpose of the gathering in verse 5 is to destroy the entire land of Babylon. God will summon his consecrated ones in order to destroy not just the city, but the whole land of Babylon, meaning Shinar, S-H-I-N-A-R, the land of Shinar. Okay, that's your lot for this week. Study hard, grow strong. We'll see you again next week. And remember, hop onto the website ariel.org.au or onto our YouTube channel where you'll find these videos uploaded within a very short space of time. Thank you for coming.